So thrilled today to be able to introduce you guys to Paula Tesoriero, who really needs no introduction. She is, of course, New Zealand's Disability Rights Commissioner. Paula, thank you for being with Awhina Matua. We're really, really pleased to have you here with us. Now, a little while ago, you spoke to the Boards of Trustees Association because education is always a really big issue for us. Can we just ask you to share what you spoke to them about, please, so we know what we can expect from the boards?
Thanks, Fiona, and kia ora tātou, everybody. Ko Paula Tesoriero tōku ingoa. As Fiona has outlined, I'm the Disability Rights Commissioner with a broad mandate around protecting and promoting the rights of disabled people. And as most of you will know, the reason I use that term is to reflect the social model of disability, which talks about our impairments as not the reason for being disabled, but actually it's the environment and the structures and policies and constructs around us. And I remind us of that at the start of this conversation because it was indeed something that I reminded the New Zealand School Trustees Association of at the various meetings actually that I've had with them, including the most recent one with their regional leaders. And it's a message which I reinforce to all government agencies and organisations that I meet with, because I want to remind decision makers of their responsibility to break down those barriers. This is a collective responsibility. So I start with that point. So when I met with the local school trustees, or these were regional trustees. And I should say I've done a lot of work with the School Trustees Association, spoken at conferences and spoken to individual boards of trustees to try and, increase some of the messaging around this. But what I talk about is I remind schools of their legal obligations and their moral obligations. I talk about how inclusion in classrooms is shown internationally from studies that have been done to not only benefit disabled learners, but non-disabled learners. And actually, if we think about changing attitudes over time, and we want our future employers, the non-disabled ones, to be just matter of fact and fine to hire disabled people, they need to be in an education system where disability is understood and welcomed. It's really, I remind school boards of trustees what their obligations are under the Education Act. They need to make sure that children from their area are able to attend their school. And I still hear, and I get very frustrated and angry, and parents will be even more angry and frustrated with situations where children are still suggested to go to the school down the road, or they might get a better experience here, or this school is better set up. And actually, at the end of the day, we want every school to be inclusive, and we want families to have choice, and we want young people to be able to go to school with their sibling and experience all that is experienced in the school environment. What I also talk to about schools is to be very explicit in their commitment to inclusive education. So have a clear intention in their school strategy, make sure that their school charter is very clear on inclusion. I ask boards of trustees to consider how they measure that inclusion. So what does good actually look like? And I also spend a lot of time talking to the Education Review Office about making sure that disability is a focus in their reviews of schools. I talk to school boards about making sure their policies are really inclusive. So even things like school camps, school sports, all of those things which, I know growing up as a disabled person and being excluded from going to school camp, that's the kind of thing that sits with you for the rest of your life. And it need not actually be the case. And so it is encouraging school boards and leaders to think about not just inclusion inside that one classroom, but the whole school community and all it offers. And that is a very, very important point. I also talk to school boards about making sure that disability is talked about, and that when they're talking about diversity, when they're thinking about diversity of their teachers and their workforce, to also be thinking about disability. I talk to boards about, I encourage them to look at what their data on educational outcomes are and how they're doing for disabled young people. How is the curriculum used and adapted for young disabled people? And actually, is the curriculum always being adhered to and followed? So I really try and invite boards to ask the critical questions of their principal and school community to make sure that they are setting an expectation and asking those questions about having an inclusive school environment. And, you know, there are so many reasons why that's a great thing, right? But for school boards to reflect their local community, actually it's really, really important that they have an environment which is welcoming for their young people. So while school boards play such an important role in the devolved education system that we have, I also try and remind everyone that there are a number of players in our education system. In fact, I was astounded when I took on this role and met with all of the peak bodies and all of the everyone in the education system. It's a complex and busy system, and everyone has different responsibilities in it. But the things which I'm really focused on at the moment is to make sure that the work that is being done as part of the education reform process to look at what curriculum and assessment looks like is actually to make sure that the right people are around the table to help shape the ministry's thinking around what an inclusive curriculum and set of assessment tools really looks like. Now, I'm not an expert in the curriculum, but we have experts in New Zealand who can view this through a disability lens. And so making sure those people are at the table. We also need to make sure that we are having an influence in the workforce development and making sure that we have disabled teachers and leaders, but also that actually we are supporting and training a future workforce and upskilling the knowledge of the current workforce to really understand inclusive education. There's also, I think, a need, and it's something I've tried to get in a number of legislative reforms but haven't been successful, is although our Education Act says every child in New Zealand has the right to an education, good, tick, yes. But actually what the UNCRPD says is that your legislation should embed the right to inclusive education. Now that, in my mind, some people disagree with me in agencies, but in my mind, actually that right in our Education Act to an inclusive education system would really lift the focus and expectations of delivering against the CRPD and making sure we have an inclusive education system. So I think policy is really important. I think as parents, you know, often that contact is with very much your school and perhaps your board of trustees. And so I think that advocacy at that level is really important. There are also the other bodies that play a really critical role. So the teachers' unions, the principals' unions. And, you know, we've had some things that have come out of the Principals Federation recently, sort of talking about, you know, excluding disabled, well, actually they didn't use the word disabled, but excluding children with particular behavioural issues if the ministry couldn't secure the health and safety of everybody. And a number of us, including myself, actually came down pretty heavy on that, because that's not the education system that we want. And we have to move the system away from looking at individual children and deciding that they're problems, and actually realizing the system is the problem. The system is the thing that has to adapt, not individual children who have a range of behavioral, sometimes trauma. You as parents know all of these things far, far better than me. So I encourage parents to talk out about those things as well. The other thing is, I've had some really good sessions with the Education Review Office, and, you know, they are taking much more of a focus moving forward around what the system looks like, as distinct from going into individual schools and saying, well, how's that school doing? How's that school doing? I mean, that's all important, and they'll keep doing that. But they're starting to look now at trying to figure out what more national reviews look like of how the system is going. And so, look, I know, again, you know, parents have probably heard lots of things the ministry might be doing over the years, and it's certainly not my job to defend government or explain government, but I do think it's fair to say recently I have seen some shifts and some positive levers for change. And if those levers get pulled properly, and, you know, I do my job properly and hold them to account, and others do too, then I am feeling actually a little more hopeful than when I first came in to the role. So I say that not to set up false expectations, but I think just to acknowledge that I think the tide is turning. And speaking of the tide turning, I wonder if I might talk about a really exciting piece of work that we have underway.
You can, and we'll put it in a part 2, because I don't want to cut down any of what you've just said. So thank you for now, and we'll hear from part 2 shortly.